Well, thank you to Emily. Thanks to HDSA and all of you guys here this afternoon. And I agree with you. I hope that, feeling wide awake after lunch. So yeah, we'll warm up a little bit. But today I'll be sharing a little bit with you guys about therapy in the context of HD, but also more broadly. We'll get out of here in about 15 minutes or so, but no, this is actually like a very loaded subject for most people. So I'm glad that you guys are here and willing to talk about it with me. So without further ado, I do not have any disclosures, and these are HDSA's important slides that they show you. Okay. So who am I? Why should I be talking with you guys about therapy? Thanks to Emily for introducing me. A little bit more about my background with that, as well, is that I've worked in the HD field for about 3 years now with Vanderbilt's Medical Center. But prior to that, I was actually working with older adults who were experiencing depression. I was in Massachusetts, not Tennessee, but there's depression all over. So some similar things there. And then went on to work with veterans who were having some chronic mental health issues at the VA in Massachusetts too. There's a few things that I care about on here as well that I'll rattle off for you. So really, it's important that people are able to access therapy. I hope some of you were able to see Dr. Zarati's talk this morning. He kind of touched on the subject that this is not always something that's available to everybody. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Also that we need therapies that are adapted for HD. And so we'll touch on that too, because there's lots of therapies that exist in the world, but what things are right for us is a huge question. I got a number of interests here too that hopefully are relevant to you guys as well. But let me get down to a few things for today. So I have a few goals, and a couple things I'd like to note here are that in the way that any good therapist would, I would want to make sure that we laid these things out before we started. So I'd like to make sure that you guys know who I am and why I'm here and why I'm qualified to talk with you. And then at the same time, I'd want you to want to say, these are the things that I can do and what I can show to you. So a couple of things about therapy there. So today I'd like to review different types of therapy, why they might be relevant to HD. Kind of increase awareness about how we could access therapies. There's a variety of ways, and it's pretty different now in 2024 after we've been through COVID and gone online in all these different ways. We might consider what qualities to look for in a therapist, and we can discuss that. And then learning how to make the most out of a therapy session, because you get this time slot that you're expected to address all of these things in, and what do we do with that? So we'll talk about that a bit more. I've got an agenda, but what I will say is that this is much better if we can kind of talk together, because I'm going to present to you guys what I know about this subject, but it's your job to poke holes in it and tell me, oh, actually I tried that thing and that didn't work out well, or I wasn't able to access it for this reason. So please, hands, however you want to stop. Emily's got microphones too, so I'd love to hear from you. So we'll talk about it in this way of what is therapy, why should I consider seeking therapy, where do I find a therapist, who is the right therapist for me, and then how do I actually do therapy? What is the doing part? So a few terms that I think are relevant that I'd like to touch on first. So we're talking about therapy in a mental health context. There are all kinds of therapies. There are physical therapies, occupational, speech. People will reference medications and drugs as therapies. All of these things are true. But psychotherapy is kind of the description that we would use for a therapy that's to address the mind or the mental health. Comes from ancient Greek, talking about actually really healing the soul, right? Healing the spirit and the kind of things that are internal to us, our real life experiences. I would distinguish, but also include counseling and coaching in this, simply because these are other approaches to addressing similar issues. So coaching is often that assistance or guidance that maybe is not a set therapy in the way that we would say like cognitive behavioral therapy is a therapy, but it's still very relevant. Often the issues that we're facing in HD, the issues that we're facing in all kinds of different difficulties in life are things that we want to talk with somebody about and be able to navigate, even if they're not coming in with like, well, this is the way that I might address them. It's something that a counselor might discuss and talk with you about. Same with a coach, that might just be more practical information and knowledge. A good therapist will probably be integrating these kinds of ideas all together, but just to differentiate, because often these terms are used kind of interchangeably. Couple other words that are a little less friendly to most people If you guys have heard the word pathology before, this is a description of kind of when something deviates from the normal or what constitutes a disease. You might meet a physician or someone that says they're a pathologist and are really good at identifying the problems that we're going through or having. What can be challenging is sometimes when people are pathologized, and that can happen in therapy, that can happen in any medical setting. And so I just want to address that because there is a real utility to that term. There's a purpose for it, but we don't want to pathologize people and say you are your disease, you are the only thing that you have, because there's so many more aspects to people. Similarly with diagnosis, sometimes we get a diagnosis in a medical setting and we're like, wow, that answered the questions and the difficulties that I was having, like it's an explanation for something. Other times diagnoses can be used in a therapeutic context that kind of puts people in a box and feels really bad. And so I'd like to go with this second definition that we have on here, that a diagnosis is really more of an investigation at times. So it's kind of like, what is the underlying condition or cause that contributes to a certain state that we're having? And often these are numerous, right? Particularly in the context of having something like depression or some other mental health or psychiatric issue, there's all of these different aspects of us as people. And so a diagnosis can be important and relevant, but is sometimes that kind of walking the edge of, is this helpful or not to me? So we'll talk about that a little further. Lastly, I'd just like to I'll use the word experience a lot during this. The way that I think about experience is kind of real lived expertise. These are the things that we go through in life and encounter and live that makes each of you the experts in who you are, right? Like if I am in therapy with a patient or a client and I'm talking with them, I want to know what they're going through. Like they're the ones that are the best expert in their experience in life, not me. And I'm there to kind of navigate this space with them. So just to acknowledge your lived experience is important and extremely valuable. So what is therapy? I'm going to give a brief history, and I'm hopeful that everyone can stay awake through this after lunch. But there's some interesting things. We've kind of come through this whole trajectory over the past 2,000 plus years, right? These are things that we've been building up for a while. And these lines in bold, what is going on with people, right? These are my thoughts on this, so just a heads up about that. I was kind of trying to capture what's the question that we've been asking at each of these eras in time. And so really before the 1800s, approximately, there's a lot that happened before then. But before then, we were kind of like, what's happening? All these different people on here were philosophers, people that worked in the church or in their own religious settings, and we're kind of just trying to come up with explanations for what's going on in the world, what's happening with the problems that people experience. You'll see descriptions of kind of different mental health conditions that happened over time, and they're like, well, maybe it's because people's blood is too thick and it's causing this problem, or maybe you need to go through this specific set of steps in order to alleviate this thing. And some of those things worked and others did not. But people had a lot of ideas and would try different things, which was important. Some of those as well, I have at the bottom here writings of physicians and people in asylum care. These were early writings that we heard from people who were, said to be, crazy, which was a word that we were like, this is not a good description for what's happening. This doesn't actually give us any insight into people's experience. But we were able to hear from people like, this is what the lived experience of that was like early on. And so they're, again, trying to treat these in all of these multitude ways. One of the biggest problems, just to note on this, was that people took a very moralist approach to it. So the idea that if you're having challenges with mental health, it may be a personal failure. It may be something wrong with you that you're not able to deal with the conditions of life. And I would like to challenge that today, particularly. But that's also kind of one of the developments that's happened over time. So we began to think about, well, what if there are conditions and things that are happening in people's lives and happening in their minds that we need a way to address? We can't do this same thing where we, treat with these different herbs or combination of things. What if we need to find a different way to address them? And so you guys may recognize this guy with his dapper suit and cigar, but Sigmund Freud, if you've heard of him, was one of the first people to say, what if we could talk with people and that could be a way into the mind? What if we could get some information on kind of how people are thinking? What are they experiencing? What's actually going on in here that we want to address? He also had lots of interesting ideas, many of them to do with, family dynamics for one, but he had a lot of ideas that didn't quite pan out, but also began to kind of develop this school of thought along with these other folks about how can we consider what the ailments of the mind are and then begin to address them through conversation and gathering information and sharing back information. So pretty big leap at that point, not too long ago. And so after this, there were a bunch of different schools of thought on this idea. People were proposing these different theories about like, well, what does the mind actually do? We can interact with it now. We can put information in and get other information out. There were some people who called themselves behaviorists or had these ideas that they were like, the mind is this black box or this machine that if we put some sort of simulation in, if you experience pain and you say, oh, I shouldn't touch that thing anymore, you can learn from that, and that can change the way that we interact with the world. So they had, again, some good ideas, some that didn't work out so well. My illustration here is if you guys have heard of Pavlov, is kind of like one of the classic examples of behaviorism with his dogs. He would go in and feed them each day, and he realized that before he even got there, they would start to salivate, and it's because he was accidentally ringing this bell on the door that was like, oh, there's this connection between the bell gets me food. And so we had this idea for humans as well. We had the notion that there's things that we could do to alter people's behaviors to make for better circumstances. And so it's a pretty good idea. There's some of these tools that we see in modern therapies as well, particularly, for example, if you think about post-traumatic stress, where people have been exposed to something that was harmful to them and now have that experience in other settings that don't match that initial insult. And so there's lots of ways to untrain that we can be exposed to things and begin to feel safe again in our bodies and in our experience. So some good ideas there. Then we have this kind of, I wouldn't call it a blip, it was a pretty big section of time, but we had these existential humanistic therapies that have been built up over time, kind of beginning with some of these thoughts from people like Viktor Frankl or Yalom, who were really trying to say, people are humans. Maybe if we didn't realize that before, but people have really complex experiences that we should acknowledge, and that they have inherent worth and value as people. This chart here is actually Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's not actually specifically existential humanist, but it's built on that premise that actually at some point, one of the things that we might want to seek in life is notice that we have motivations that are important to us, things that give us value and worth in the world. And as a lot of these therapies were built on that kind of, or on the ideas of a lot of existential philosophers, if you've spent any time with some of those. So another important time period that now is integrated into a lot of our more modern therapies too. I hope you guys can read this slide. I'm realizing it maybe is a little small here, but this is kind of, again, really just the past, well, I was going to say 50 years, the past 70 years now, where people really began to think about some of the modern schools of thought about how we would address the mind. So we've gone through all of these journeys. We've said, okay, here's a little dabble. These things worked in these contexts. But really in like the 1950s and 70s, Aaron Beck was kind of one of the first people, along with Albert Ellis, to propose that what if we could influence people's ideas influence their behaviors by considering what ideas they have about the world. So we think that people have different beliefs about themselves and others. We notice that people have thoughts when they react to a situation, and that influences how they decide to go forward and what they do next. And that influences their emotions as well. So he kind of proposed this cognitive model where we're like, maybe if we address the thoughts, maybe then we'll get this downstream effect of influencing how people live in the world. There were a number of people that said, oh, that's a great idea, and developed and then took these things and integrated them into other new therapies. So they have this section that's called Third Wave. You may have noticed that my questions for what people were asking get a little bit more complex the further on that we go. And so what if we took all of these different theories and started to make them into a unified therapy? They're like, we can give this as a treatment, and we have all of these different tools now that we can give to people. And that was a novel idea at some point, right? We didn't have to have one ideology about how we could address the issues that people were having. I'll talk about these therapies a little bit more, but acceptance and commitment, dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT, mindfulness-based therapy, solutions-based, these are things that emerged out of that and that are really relevant today. And then lastly, there are many, many therapies that exist nowadays that have their different uses. Some of them have evidence to support them, others do not. But in a postmodern world, we might ask ourselves, like, what if people actually interpret reality through their own experiences and begin to kind of, develop their own narratives about how life and the world works and how they're a part of it. And we get into some of these kind of more complex therapies that are kind of investigating what the human experience is like in that way. So there's a lot that's happened, to say the least. But I'm going to highlight a few of them, and I'm going to step off my historical soapbox now. So what is therapy, actually, right? So these are, I've told you a little bit about some of the ideas people had when going into that, but there's a few things that I think are pretty relevant that we should consider when we're thinking about what therapy is. This is a different kind of relationship, right? Like often we may have grown up or been in settings where we talk with our family or people that we trust and care for. Maybe it's a coworker or a colleague, somebody that you just know in life that you are like, oh, I could share this with them. I could tell them about what's going on. And therapy is a little bit unique. So these are some of the aspects to it. So therapy would be a temporary relationship centered on an identified goal. So what that means, right, is that therapy is not for life. This is a period of time that I'm going to work towards something that I'm focused on or trying to address a problem that I'm experiencing with somebody who's going to navigate that with me. That's kind of the key here. And the good thing about it not being for life, as much as it's nice to have somebody that knows your journey and knows your whole experience, is that usually it means you've succeeded if you're not working together anymore. It means that you may have addressed the thing that you set out to do. It doesn't mean that there won't be other things that come up or that you would return to work with them again, but it's a temporary relationship in that sense. Therapy is an agreement to investigate and address life's difficult experiences together. I think this is kind of one of the really most special parts about therapy, is that we have friends and family that we never actually get into those kind of underneath things that we're like, oh, this is something I've been carrying around that sits deeply within me that I don't talk about all the time. I don't want to bring the vibe down in the room. And so this is an agreement, right? We've said, this is what we're going to set out to do and what the point of this relationship is. This is why we're spending time together. So there's an agreement there. A consent of a client to share vulnerable information with a professional that is based on trust and mutual respect. And this is a really wordy way of saying, right, that we want to, when we agree to something, we want to say, oh, I give you my word. I consent to the fact that we're going to do this thing together, and you are not going to, damage the things that I say or use them against me. The point of this is that we're building trust, and there's a mutuality. There's a two-way street here. Even if the therapist is saying, I'm not going to tell you everything about my life, they are there to be in this with you, and that's a shared experience. We should expect in therapy that the professional, whoever your therapist is, has the knowledge that's relevant to what you want to address, and the skill to take care of you with that, so that when they pass themselves off, when I introduce myself to you in a room as your therapist, and I say to you, this is what I can do, this is what I'm capable of, that I'm going to bring all of that to bear when we're working together, right? That I'm not just going to kind of pass something off and say, oh, well, this might work, this could be okay. I'm going to tell you exactly what I can actually do. And if I can't, then I may say, okay, this may not serve us. This may not be the best idea, but we're going to work on those things together. And that's something that I should share up front as a therapist. And lastly, a stewardship. So I use this word as in the sense of when someone is a client of mine, when I'm working with someone, they're sharing their time with me. That's valuable. Time is a valuable resource. They're maybe paying me, right? Like probably paying. And that's important too. Like if you're putting your time and resources and laying all of your experiences out there on the line, I should have respect for that. And I should be very conscientious of the time and resources that you're giving me. So I should be conscientious of that continuously and think about like, okay, is this valuing you? Is this benefiting you? I wanted to include a cool acronym here, so I made that into traces. So you can, if that helps you, but these are some pretty wordy descriptions. But hold on to that one in your back pocket. So why should I consider seeking therapy? This is a short list. There are so many things that we could consider using therapy for. You will see many elongated ellipses in this presentation because I can't possibly encapsulate all of it in this amount of time. But some of the things that happen with HD that we know about, experiencing stress, particularly uncontrollable stress, noticing that there are patterns of thought and things that I get stuck in, that's hard to get out of. If anyone's ever experienced a period of grief or depression or anxiety, sometimes it's difficult for us to get off of a certain idea that can just feel like it's weighing you down. Getting difficult information. This is a part of life in general, right? But this is particularly a part of HD. This is really relevant to how we navigate the experience of getting some sort of news that we don't really know what to do with yet, or that we hoped wouldn't be there. Regulating mood, right? Those ups and downs in life. Some of us have really big swings of it. Some of us have a little bit more subtle, but those things can be really debilitating at different times. So we might address that with therapy. Sometimes I have unhealthy habits, right? I don't know if anyone was in Dr. Sung's talk on sleep by any chance today, but yeah, he's some. There are all kinds of things that happen that can contribute to our negative habits. And with that, there are therapies to address that. So for example, he referenced cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And so we might think about specific ways to address difficult habits. And then lastly, improving overall health. So if we address some of these things, if we're going back to our initial description, what are the difficulties and the things that happen in the mind, we can imagine that there are downstream effects of those. So if I'm addressing the things that maybe start a process, that start me on a path that isn't serving me or is unhealthy for me, therapy may improve my overall health behaviors. There's a few things on here that I included as well that are important to note. So all of these things have broader reaching effects, right? So we know if anyone's been experienced depression themselves in lives or been around somebody, a family member, care partner, parent, anybody that has gone through that, we know that this kind of has this tendency to spread out and reach into all of these different domains. And so I just want to draw attention to that last piece, that we can include other people in therapies. These aren't just things that are for us. There's this kind of classic representation of the therapist will sit in their chair while the therapized lays on a couch, right? Like, or is the person who speaks their mind and then they pick it apart. And actually that's not how we do things all the time anymore, right? Like there's the ability for multiple people to be in the room, people that are influenced and affected by what's happening in your life right now that you can include or choose not to. Some things are more private and that's okay too, but we can be flexible. We touched on this a little bit, but I did think it was important to go from why would I do this to when should I consider seeking therapy? Because sometimes we kick it around for a long time and we're like, oh, maybe not, maybe now. And so difficult transitions are part of that, right? A lot of our talks today have been about things like gene testing or considering whether it's time to have a child, considering whether it's time to stop working, change to a different type of work. There's all kinds of different issues that we can go through. And so these sorts of transitions may be times that we say, oh, actually, I need somebody that's not just me, or I need somebody that has another perspective on this that's not so in it, because I love my partner, I love my family member or my child, but I can't talk with them about all these issues, or they just don't know. They just don't know how to address it. Changes in mood and thinking. Again, this is kind of like things that can change over time. I may notice I'm like, oh, actually, I don't think about the things in the way that I used to. It's hard for me to get out of this this cycle or this hole where I'm just like kind of not really thinking in the way that is as clear or as positive about the future. And so if I notice those changes, I might say, okay, it's time for therapy. Getting a specific diagnosis, I'll touch a little bit more on that in a moment. Grief and loss, we know these are huge parts of life in general, but particularly HD. We're talking about something that affects entire families, and so often all of our families with HD have way more loss than you would expect in the general population, maybe at a younger age. Uncontrollable stress, traumatic experiences, communication issues or relational issues. This is kind of a pretty big one because we notice that there's certain times where, yeah, there's something breaking down here. The way that I think and communicate, or the way that my partner, this person in my life is doing that, isn't working for me right now, or I'm just having a lot of trouble navigating it. And a therapist can step back and say, okay, like, let's problem solve this. Let's troubleshoot that. Let's consider what communication skills maybe aren't being utilized right now. And these are quotes from people that I've met. These are quotes from people that I've done therapy with. And I think that they illustrate it so well. Like there's so many simple things in life, these little experiences that add up over time, that we say, one day I'm like, I'm feeling kind of down. It's hard to get things going, but I'll figure it out. And over time, these things can really build and they gain momentum and weight. And so, at some point we may say, it's time to make a change. That can be its own part of therapy. But noticing that, like, I'm ready to step forward into experiencing life differently. or the weight of these experiences is too much, and I want that to change. So, many reasons. I'd like to address here really quick. Sometimes people have a conception that because their diagnosis is not specifically one of mental health, it is not exclusively a psychiatric diagnosis. They're like, this is medical. So we can think about that in an HD context, right? We often are encouraged to think of HD as this is a disease of the brain. This is something that changes my neurobiology, and that's altered over time. But all of the cascading experiences, all of the things that surround that change are also part of that experience. And so therapy is something that can be used in combination with other therapies, other treatments too. We can work with our medical providers, we can work with our rehab people, we can take medications, we can do all these things and access therapy still to address the lived experience of that. Okay. I've talked about Dr. Zarate a few times, but I'll bring him up again. He's in here, just that he's present with us. But he acknowledged today that there's minimal research that's been done in HD on what types of therapies are specifically relevant. Research is important, right? It tells us that the tools that we're using work for what we're trying to address. And in HD, that's complex. We know that HD is complex, and I don't need to tell all of you that. But we want that to be something that changes. So I'll talk about a few of the therapies that I mentioned earlier and why they might be specifically relevant. But the fact being that we don't have all of this research support that we want yet to say that this is the best way to do this therapy with someone that has HD, with someone that's been experiencing the impact of HD on their life. So yeah, there's lots to do in this area as well. You should go find him and talk to him. He's got a lot of great ideas about this subject. So you've heard me reference it, cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. This is one of the broadest evidence-based therapies that exists today. It's focusing on the connections between thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. This wheel has one direction, but I would say they probably go in multiple directions as well. This is just a nice graphic from the internet. But it's based on the premise that our interpretations of reality, of the world around us, influence our reactions to our circumstances. So when I think about myself in relation to a diagnosis like HD, I might say, well, what's the point of doing anything? Is there any hope for the future? And we, in a CBT context, might say, okay, let's investigate that thought. Is that true? Is there truly not hope? And so, we talked about some of the philosophers and people that influence the thinking early on. They will do what's called Socratic questioning. So this guy Socrates, who would just ask incessant questions over and over to all of his students. And that's maybe what your therapist might do, but in a bit more loving context. And again, the idea being like, let's investigate the things that are influencing our thoughts and beliefs about the world. Can we alter those things? Because sometimes they're not true. Sometimes we have errors in our thinking, which unfortunately is really common, and it's really hard to see them when we're inside of that. So CBT is focused on addressing that. CBT is highly structured, which means that each session will follow a pretty rote formula. The nice thing about that is that we can test it really well. We can bring it into all these different contexts and say, okay, this is how I would do CBT for depression, for anxiety, for attentional difficulties, for insomnia. There are many, many variations on this at this point, and it's probably one of the ones that's easiest to access. And lastly, the thing that I mostly appreciate about this one as well, and this is something that I regularly do with clients at our center, is that we can get down to some practical matters too. So the goal is not always like, well, let me just think butterflies and rainbows about the world and change my thinking into magical thinking. That's not the goal here. We actually need to also address real things that are happening in life and maybe modify those behaviors, maybe change the ways that we're relating to other people as part of that. And so there's multiple steps to this process. Dialectical behavioral therapy is one that is a little bit newer. It's one of those therapies that we talked about that's integrating all of these different schools of thought. It was originally developed for people that were actually having a lot of problems with impulses towards self-harm. If you've ever heard of a diagnosis called borderline personality disorder, it is a fraught diagnosis. It's very stigmatized. There's been a lot of issues with that over time. But this was the first therapy that was designed specifically for that. And there's all kinds of really cool aspects to it. There's what we would call a full model DBT, which means like you're doing every single piece of this thing. It's really intensive. It's a lot of hours. Sometimes people will do this even in an inpatient setting, which can be really great for a lot of people. Most of us don't have access to that or time for that, particularly if we're trying to, make our way through life. And so I would say what's nice about this, there's what's now DBT skills, which is kind of the broken off piece of like, what are the practical tools that I can use in life that are from this therapy? There's many books on it, but I would recommend working with somebody that is well practiced in those or has had some experience with full model DBT. Particularly mindfulness, which I'm going to come back around to in a bit, but if you guys are familiar with it, this is a great tool just for regulation. This is a great way to kind of like address some of those fluctuations that we talked about, the ups and downs in mood, how my body feels, what kind of things are happening in my life. And then also with that, I would include distress tolerance, right? That's kind of like, I'm in an uncontrollably stressful situation. How do I get myself back to a place where I can navigate this and think about and problem solve again? So DBT is another one that we could consider in an HD context. Acceptance and commitment therapy. This is also one of those third wave ones. This is a complex therapy, but the main focus on it being, what do I think when I encounter things in life that are outside of my control? These are things that are not changeable. If I have CBT and I'm thinking about what is my thought process around a situation, maybe I can consider those and pick those apart a little bit. Some things are immovable, right? An HD diagnosis is immovable. I may not have all of the symptoms and aspects of that people can experience, but this is not something I can take away right now when I want to. And so with that in mind, ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, focuses a lot on like, well, what are my values in life? What are the things that I care about that are most important to me and I want to really focus my time on? That is the commitment aspect of it. We might say, let me focus my energy in a direction and consider that with a therapist. One of the other nice aspects about ACT is that it's kind of considering, well, how do I consider all of my life experiences in relation to each other? It's a pretty big question to ask, right? But we say that like there's all of these different things that happen in life and they each influence us in a different way. And then at some point we say, well, this is kind of what my whole life looks like, right? Like maybe there's been a time in life where I'm like, my life is not good, nothing looks good. And we might want to pick those things apart a little bit more. So ACT is relevant in HD as well. I mentioned mindfulness. If you guys are familiar with these at all, there's lots of ways to practice mindfulness. There's this guy, John Kabat-Zinn, who wrote a ton about this and has all kinds of practices. If you look online a little bit for them, you can find recordings, you can find scripts, you can find different apps and things that practice mindfulness. There are specific therapies focused on this, like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is, if you can imagine, focused on stress reduction. But they'll use things like visualization techniques, which could mean like imagining that I'm in a setting that I find peaceful, that I can return to at any given time, that allows me to watch kind of what's happening in my mind or in my body and observe those things and become a little bit more attuned to them, because sometimes we're really disconnected from those aspects of life. And so you can be guided through that with a therapist. Once you've learned some of those skills, they're things that you can keep practicing on your own. I included relaxation practices here as well. Mindfulness is not inherently a relaxation practice. Sometimes it can be stressful when we find, oh, I'm investigating my mind and there's stressful things happening in there. One of the nice things about these, though, is that some of them can be used as tools when we're saying, I don't have all of the cognitive skills or the cognitive faculties to investigate every one of my thoughts. I don't have the same self-reflective capacities that I used to. And so these are things that if we learn them early on, we're like, okay, this isn't just something that someone's introducing to me now. This is a habit. This is something that I can do throughout my life and return to. And can be used for when we're having issues with memory or feeling overstimulated easily by lots of things going on in the environment. So all really relevant and things that can be done even later on. Okay, I've talked a lot. Any conflicts so far? Anything that we're like, no, that doesn't really resonate with my experience? Good. No, just kidding. Please, I do encourage you to speak up if there's things that were like, this hasn't been it. So here's kind of what, if you said, okay, I'm going to go to my therapist's office, I've made an appointment, or I've talked with somebody at their front desk. Here's what are some of the things that you might run into. Explanation of services. This is kind of what we've done so far, right? I've told you who I am. I've told you what I'm able to do. I've told you kind of what this therapy might look like. Maybe you've read a little bit about it, or I've given you some literature. This might include things like how many sessions, what type of sessions will they be, how long will they be. The next piece is informed consent. I'll merge that here with limits of confidentiality. So informed consent is the idea that like you need to agree to be a part of therapy, like our earlier slide about consent, and I need to tell you all of the aspects of that. Like there are benefits that we could experience. There are risks. Like this thing may not work at all, right? You may come see me and we might work together for a while and you're like, yeah, all those things you said were gonna happen, they didn't happen. And so we need to talk about that ahead of time. Many people have kind of like a rote form about this, and part of that is that we're agreeing to work on this thing together. Limits of confidentiality are part of that. So I actually will go into another slide in a moment, so I'm not gonna go too far with this, but we expect therapy to be private, right? We expect this to be like the relationship with any other medical provider where there are limits to the ways that they share your information. In general, those things are not released unless you say that they should be released to somebody else, but there's limits. So I'm gonna get into that. Most of them are around safety. Assessment. If anyone's heard this word before, it may not be friendly to you, but being assessed doesn't feel very good, right? Like you're under a microscope, you're being asked lots of questions, all of these different things. But really the important part of this is that in a therapy relationship, I want to kind of get down to like, what are the details of it? Like, how do you respond to this situation? What's going on when in this type of thought process? People will conduct this differently. Sometimes it can be really long. Sometimes it can be more like a conversation or an interview. But an assessment is kind of the goal of saying like, all right, let's dig up some of the things. You've told me that this is a problem right now, but like I need to know some more specific details about it. You'd plan for therapy from there. So you might say, after we've done all of these things, we're like, yes, I can do this type of therapy with you. I think this will be beneficial. You might say, again, this is the way we're gonna start. This is how frequently we're gonna meet. This is what types of things we're gonna do in each session. The first session is usually different. So thinking about, okay, I'm gonna come back for another one, and it may be, I won't be as examined, I won't be assessed with all of these different questionnaires, but there will be still, pretty intimate conversations. Setting goals. This is my other fun acronym, is SMART. Specific, measurable, achievable, I'm running out of these, time-based, and if I could, I can't scroll my slide. But either way, there's the importance to set goals that we're actually able to accomplish is the main object here, is that we don't want to set things that are kind of beyond moonshots, right? They're not something that's actually going to be possible. We want to focus on what can we address right now that's going to be relevant. And then lastly is this diagnosis piece. And I'm going to come back to this one too, because it's relevant. We kind of talked about some of the issues that can happen with diagnosis. And so I want to talk about the utility of that in a therapy context. This is my brief aside about informed consent. So the limits to confidentiality are primarily around safety. That meaning that, say that we're meeting and you tell me, I have thought at times that life may not be worth living anymore. I don't know if I can keep going with this because it's painful. Like, this is too painful to bear. And so in that context, I might ask you some more questions. I'm like, hey, I'm concerned for you. Like that is a hard way to be living. Are you thinking about harming yourself? Is this something that, have you considered ending your life or planned a way to do that? The relevance of that is that sometimes we can have a conversation and say, okay, like I understand where you're at. Like I might feel the same way, or maybe I have felt the same way in life. But sometimes we say, like, this is urgent. Like if we don't talk about this right now, if we don't address this right now, then I'm worried that something's gonna happen before I get to see you again. This should always be a conversation, right? This should not be something where you tell someone that thought and they react and say like, well, this is we can't do anything more. There's nothing that we can talk about. But the concern about the limits of confidentiality here for me is that I may say like, we need to involve other people. There's other people that are important to be a part of a conversation where this is an emergency. But this is an ongoing conversation. This is not something that we should be reactive to and just say like, oh, this is the only thing that we can do. So talking with your therapist about what that limit is, what their lines are before starting and getting into therapy is really important. I would always encourage people that if they're in a therapeutic context to share if they're having those kinds of thoughts. But it's important to know what will happen in that context. Sometimes people need inpatient care, but we don't want that to be something where you and I have been talking and having these great conversations and really making some progress, and suddenly I sever that relationship because I say, well, I can't do anything for you. You need to be in this one place. So this is an important discussion and part of informed consent to know what will happen. The other context where information is not private is if it is subpoenaed by a court. And that's unfortunately something that's out of the therapist's hands typically. That would have to do with external legal involvement if you had that. So that could be, it can be a lot of different settings. But the thing to note about that is most therapists will do their best to protect that information and not share it with the court if it is not necessary. If they're subpoenaed, it may be necessary and they may not be able to hold that back. But for example, what I will do is I'll keep a certain amount of documentation that's like my medical documentation. I'm like, this is what we're talking about. This is the type of therapy we're doing. And then I may have more detailed notes that are for my own recollection and how we talk about things. Because I'm like, these are the specific experiences that do not necessarily need to be a part of someone's otherwise medical record. These are my psychotherapy notes. They aren't relevant to that. Again, they can be subpoenaed, but there can be layers to that. So that's something to talk with a therapist about. Any questions about this? Good. Okay. Lots of fun things there, I know. This is my brief aside about diagnosis. So most therapists will give you a diagnosis at some point. This kind of goes back to our differentiation between coaching, counseling, psychotherapy. A coach will probably not give you a diagnosis, right? They may be like, oh, this is the thing we're working on, but they're not going to use the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, DSM, to give you a coded diagnosis. The problem with diagnoses is that they can be like, you're labeling me with something. You're saying that I am this thing, and I do not believe that's true. Some people have used that kind of language in the past, and that's extremely relevant to me to push back against and say, people are not their diagnoses. They're experiencing things that cause an array of things that we may have seen in other people before and identified, and there's a way to treat them. One of the important aspects of this is that they may help us get insurance payment for our therapy. Insurance will pretty much always ask for a diagnosis, right? I went to urgent care and they gave me something for, an ear infection. And they need to say he had an ear infection. That's why we're giving him this medication. It's the same in this context. And so I highlight may here because all insurances will not pay for therapy. You should want to investigate before you start therapy. If you expect your insurance to pay for it, find out what your insurance benefits are for behavioral health specifically, or mental health. Usually insurance plans will use behavioral health as the term. The relevance again of this diagnosis is like, you can talk about it with your therapist or you cannot. So you don't necessarily need to know. So for example, I have a fun diagnosis that I see really often called an adjustment disorder. And if we talk about that, you're like, what does that even mean? Like who's being adjusted? And the thing is that it's just saying like, oh, this person is adjusting to something in life and they're experiencing some sort of mood change because of that. They're experiencing anxious symptoms. They're experiencing depressive symptoms. Like they're having these things because they're like, yeah, my life is changing and I'm trying to adapt to that. It sounds really scary. There's like a F43.23 code attached to it. They're like, what is that? I don't need that thing. But insurance may pay attention to that. And that's something that they would say, okay, we can pay for this session for this amount of time for these however many weeks because we know that that's what it's for. So I'll again, no more soapbox on this, but it is important. This references our informed consent portion about a diagnosis being a part of legal documentation when it's in a medical setting. Again, not to be used for stigmatizing or pathologizing people. Extremely important. Okay. So we talked about kind of that initial process of getting into therapy, what it looks like. These are kind of general trends. This is not exactly what it will always look like, but I do think it's important to differentiate between how in-person and telehealth sessions may be different. Timing, in person, you've heard of the therapist hour or the psychologist hour being 50 minutes, not 60 minutes. That's generally true. And so just to be aware of that. On telehealth, it can be a little bit different. There's different platforms that will allow for different lengths. So sometimes you can meet with someone for 30 minutes. Sometimes it can be hard to accomplish a lot in that, but you can kind of determine what works for you in your life. For an in-person would typically be meeting with them in their office or in a clinic setting. Some people will work in people's homes, which is fantastic, but that's often not available to people. Whereas on telehealth, you can be in a private, quiet location of your choosing. Quiet is important. I've met with people who are in their cars. I've met with people who are at like a Dunkin' Donuts before. It's a little difficult. So just a heads up about that. In-person sessions, so depending on who your therapist is, how things work, you may have kind of varied means of communication between sessions. So what I mean by that is that you may be calling their office in order to reach them or leave a message. You may sometimes have a messaging service, but not always. It's going to depend on the person's practice. So how do you get in touch with your therapist in the relevance of something like an emergency situation, cancellation, reschedule, whatever those things are, important to note. I say telehealth is often asynchronous because it's usually messaging, right? Like it's usually you like typed a message into a portal and they're getting it at some point and you're sending things back and forth and it's not in real time. So that's important to note, particularly in an emergency context, because it is probably not going to work out to reach out to them in an emergency unless they've explicitly stated so. Some downsides on either of these, you have to travel into an office for the most part for an in-person session. That takes time, that takes resources, all of these different things. But the counter to that is in a telehealth setting, you may not really get to interact with each other that well. You're kind of like, okay, what are they doing with their body? Are they paying attention to me? Are they really listening to me? All of those ways that we communicate that are much more subtle or can be lost on telehealth. So where do I find a therapist? There's lots of ways these days. Not some are better than others, but there's many of them. You could go to the HDSA website. That's a really good way to start. They have a really awesome service that can connect people with free telehealth sessions for a set amount of time, and through Amwell, which is listed on our other side there for telehealth. Again, there's all sorts of ways to search. You can search online. That can be really overwhelming. If anyone's ever been to Psychology Today before, it is a long list of every single person that's been licensed in some way in your area. And that can be overwhelming, but you can use filters. There's all kinds of different ways to do that. The biggest things I want to note here are how do you vet people, right? Like we'll get into like who's the right person for me to work with, but when we're exposed to all of these things, we're kind of like, this is a lot of information. So there needs to be a way to boil it down a little bit. I enjoy the local options for that reason because sometimes they will have like relationships with people that are just around you and can develop that connection a little bit better. So for example, an HDSA center or through the chapter social worker or otherwise, talk to your primary care is probably one of the most simple ones. You're like, okay, I'm in the office today. Like, who should I see? Do you have a therapist? Do you have integrated behavioral health? Some of these other ones can be great. NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is a great resource. They've often done a lot of the legwork for us in each local area. Google has not done the legwork for us. That's just us searching, right? But you can find good things on there nonetheless. And then lastly, I have all these telehealth platforms listed here because there are so many of them. There's a million of them these days. And so each of them are going to have a slightly different experience. Each of them are going to have a slightly different platform or process for getting started. I will touch on this as our next slide because it's relevant. So when it comes to payment, there are different models that exist nowadays for telehealth payment. So sometimes you can say, I'm going to pay a subscription to this website and I get this number of visits per month and I can use as many or as few of them as I want. And that's kind of interesting. That's not something that we've usually had for most of the history of therapy. Otherwise, we can find the ones that are like, okay, we can use insurance for this one. And they should make sure that your insurance works before you do that. I would say, and this is probably the biggest takeaway if you want to use your insurance to pay for therapy, is always call them first. Do know the details of what your plan provides because sometimes people can get into situations where they get kind of crazy bills and we don't want that. That's never a good experience. A super bill is kind of this description of sometimes a therapist can say, these are all the things that we did and the services that we provided and what I charged you for them. And then you can take that to your insurance company and they may reimburse you. So that's what they mean when an insurance company is like, you can get reimbursement for behavioral health services. Sliding scale is good. Sliding scale means that depending on how much money you are making and if you can provide documentation of your income, the cost of therapy may be more or less. And that's, a huge positive in my perspective. That's kind of a therapy practice or a therapist saying like, yeah, we're going to adjust things because we know not everybody has access to this. And then we talked about subscription models. Okay. Everyone's still pretty awake, so that we're doing all right there. Who's the right therapist for me? This is the most loaded question, I would say, of the day. It is not one that I have a perfect answer for. The biggest thing is to talk to a lot of different people. And that means talking to a lot of different therapists. It also means talking to a lot of different people in your life that, you know, have some experience with that. Maybe they know somebody locally. Back to our local options, kind of like really vet things. And the biggest thing that I've noticed with people is that they're like, okay, like I want to go see this therapist. I trust them. I'm all in. But they get to their session and they're like, oh, that wasn't really what I thought it would be. and that's okay. This is a service like anywhere else. Sometimes people feel the same way with doctors or when they go to a medical center. You get to shop around. Sometimes everything is not available, but when it comes to therapists, don't settle for something that you're like, this isn't really working for me. Somebody that you don't trust, somebody that you don't feel like has your best interest at heart. And so talk to lots of different people is my biggest thing there. I'll jump to this one at the bottom, the rule of threes. This is not a real rule. This is a rule that I made up also, like my acronym. The rule of threes is before you give up on therapy, give 3 different therapists to try for 3 sessions. So say that I go to the first person, I'm like, I'm not sure. Give them a second session, I'm like, this is really not for me. You can bail at that point. That is okay. That's absolutely okay. But do not give up on therapy yet as a possibility for something to address the concerns that are happening in your life. It's okay to go see somebody else. I would say at least give it 3 shots. You can give it more, but threes are good things can come in 3s. Again, asking for assistance, talk to your teams, talk to the people in your life that can help you find a therapist, and trust your gut. I don't have a ton of time for this story, but I do want to share with you. So I have a family member who recently went to therapy for the first time, and they had been going through a ton of anxiety, and they went to this therapist, and really, again, they were like, well, they seem like they know what they're talking about. They seem like they're an okay person. They pose themselves in this way, and I was connected through a reliable source. And after a few sessions, they were like, this is really not for me. Like they were like, I do not feel good about the way that this person's talking to me. It doesn't feel like they're really listening to me, and they were pathologizing them was what we came down to. We had a great conversation about it eventually, but they had gone through like a few sessions of really painful experience because of that, because they're like, I trust this person. I want to know what they have to say about what's going on in my life, but it was really harmful for them. And so luckily I got to talk with her, and we like kind of got to the bottom. We're like, no, you need to try somebody else. But she had some gut feelings before that, and I would say trust those, pay attention. So some of this comes down to personal preference. I've got a fun cartoon here that talks about kind of, maybe he's throwing the person out the window because he's experiencing the stress, and he's like, oh, I finally got to throw somebody out the window. This makes me feel a lot better. Maybe it wouldn't work all the time, right? You don't always get the chance to throw somebody out the window. So like if the interaction that you're having with your therapist is one that you're noticing is not really challenging the things in your life that you're like, oh, they're really, they say yes to whatever I say. They're really friendly with me. That I like them a lot, but we don't need another friend all the time, right? Like it's nice to have someone to talk to, but this is not a replacement for that. And so kind of this combination and balancing of, I really like talking to this person. I trust them and they're nice to be around, but also that they can push back on me and kind of like challenge some of the thoughts that sometimes may not be helpful to me. We want to put those 2 things in tension. Therapists should have some training. It shouldn't be anyone off the street. This can be a psychiatrist, this can be a psychologist, this can be a clinical psychologist, this can be a social worker, all of the different letters with that, mental health counselor. These are going to vary based on state to state, and they're going to vary depending on what sort of service you want. So often, if you're looking for somebody that can do both prescribing and therapy, you may be talking with a psychiatrist. If you are looking for somebody who's going to do really specialized therapies and have a lot of training in specific areas, maybe a clinical psychologist is more appropriate. Social workers and mental health counselors, there's going to be more variability, but they can address a wide range of issues and maybe more accessible just because there's lots of them, more of them. And then the therapeutic modalities that we talked about earlier. So just a few takeaways. How do I do therapy, quote unquote, because we've talked about a lot of aspects of it. You want to enter with an open mind, right? Like we want to be in a space where we're saying, okay, I'm not having the best experiences in life right now, but I'm here to try this. Being honest, noticing that you're saying like, let me truthfully share what's going on in my life, with the exceptions of knowing what's in our informed consent, right? Like I can say like, I'm not ready to share this thing with them yet, but maybe we can get to that place. Expressing your preferences, telling people what things you appreciate and what you don't. It's okay. Again, this is a shoppable service. You're talking to somebody that you are paying to be there. So sharing with them, this thing works for me, this thing doesn't. Being the expert and the learner, you're the expert in your own life. You know what things have happened and what you've gone through. So you know about those things, but you're also in a situation where you're ready to receive some feedback and receive some information from a trusted professional. Do not people please. That is part of our shoppable service here, right? We're saying like, you're not there to impress them. This is the place to show all the things that are not the best sides of us. And so a therapist will best be able to assist if they really know what's going on and if you're not just there to impress them. Sometimes there is homework, like SMART goals. It is good to do that work outside of the sessions. Do not skip on that. And then share feedback with them. What works, what doesn't, what things are going well and not. So I think I am over our time, but thank you all. I appreciate you.